The kitchen was filled with the rich, savory scent of roasted chicken, mingling with the warm, earthy notes of rosemary and thyme. The golden glow of the oven light bathed the space in a cozy warmth, bouncing off the worn wooden cabinets. It was a familiar ritual, one that had been repeated every Friday evening for the past 18 years. Rebecca Lawson pulled on a pair of faded blue oven mitts, the same ones Michael had bought her years ago at a flea market, and carefully lifted the heavy roasting pan from the oven. The chicken, golden brown and crisp, glistened with juices that had pooled at the bottom of the pan. It was perfect as always. She had perfected the recipe over time, adjusting seasonings, tweaking cook times, making subtle improvements week after week. It was something she had started early in their marriage, back when they were still learning each other's habits and routines. Over the years it had become more than just a meal. It was an anchor, a quiet tradition that grounded their weeks. Across the kitchen, her 17-year-old daughter, Emma, moved around the dining table with practiced ease. She placed silverware and plates in their usual spots, her fingers moving with the kind of unconscious grace that comes from years of habit. She pulled her long dark hair into a loose ponytail, pausing to smooth a napkin before giving her mother a playful glance. "Mom, you've outdone yourself again," Emma said, her voice light with admiration. She took a deep breath, inhaling the aroma, and let out a dramatic sigh. "Seriously, can we eat already? I'm starving." Rebecca chuckled, setting the pan down on the counter and picking up a carving knife. "Patience," she said teasingly. "We wait for your father." She glanced at the clock, 6:47 p.m. A small frown flickered across her face. Michael wasn't at the table yet. That was unusual. He was almost always the first one seated on Friday nights, newspaper in hand, ready to unwind from the long week. He never missed their Friday dinners. Just as she finished plating the food, Michael appeared in the doorway. His broad frame filled the space, his graying hair slightly tousled, his sleeves wrinkled at the cuffs. He looked like he had been running his hands through his hair, a nervous habit of his. Rebecca's eyes flickered to his face. She recognized the look immediately. It was the same tight-lipped smile he wore when he was about to say something he wasn't sure how to deliver. The same one he had when he told her about the promotion that meant longer hours. The same one he had the day he admitted to denting her car. After 18 years, she could read him as easily as a book, and right now, his expression told her one thing. Something was coming. Michael cleared his throat. "Smells great," he said, stepping further into the room. His voice was steady, but there was something just beneath the surface, something that didn't sit right. He pulled out his chair and sat down at the head of the table, his hands folding in front of him. His eyes met Rebecca's for a brief second before shifting to Emma, who was already sliding into her seat, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension in the air. Rebecca set his plate in front of him, keeping her voice casual. "Rough day at the office?" she asked, tilting her head slightly as she studied him. It was an invitation, a gentle nudge for him to say whatever was on his mind. Michael hesitated. He picked up his fork, absently prodding a piece of chicken before finally looking up. "Not exactly," he said, his lips pressing together in a thin line. He cleared his throat again and glanced at Emma, who had paused mid-bite, watching him curiously. "Actually," he continued, his voice firmer now, "there's something I need to talk to you both about." Emma raised an eyebrow, lowering her fork. "Oh, what did you do, Dad? Forget to pay the electric bill again?" she teased, smirking. Michael let out a small chuckle, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He shook his head. "No, nothing like that." He set his fork down and leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the table's edge. The kitchen, which had felt so warm and inviting just moments ago, suddenly felt smaller, as if the air had thickened around them. Rebecca remained still, setting down her own fork and folding her hands in her lap. "Oh," she prompted, her voice even and unreadable. Michael took a deep breath as if gathering himself. "I've been thinking," he began, pausing slightly before pressing forward. "We need to reconsider our family budget a bit." He gave a small forced smile. "Starting this month, we'll manage separate finances. I've calculated everything, worked it all out in my head. I think this is fair. Each of us will spend only what we earn." Silence. Emma's head snapped up from her phone, her pretense of disinterest vanishing instantly. She stared at her father, one eyebrow arching high. Rebecca's fork paused midair. A small piece of chicken speared on the tines. She brought it to her mouth and chewed slowly, her jaw working as she processed his words. 18 years of pooling every paycheck, every bonus, every tax refund gone just like that. Emma was the first to break the silence. "Wait, hold up," she said, leaning forward, her voice sharp now. "Mom's the one who pays for everything. How's this fair if she's still covering the house and you're just, what? Keeping your retirement money?" Michael's smile faltered for the first time, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Emma, this isn't about that," he said, his tone clipped. "It's about independence. Responsibility. Your mother and I have always worked as a team, but I think it's time we each take charge of our own contributions." Emma scoffed, crossing her arms. "Contributions? Mom's the only one contributing. You've been consulting from the couch for like 3 years. Rebecca gently placed a hand on Emma's arm, her voice calm but firm. "Enough." Then, turning her gaze back to Michael, she tilted her head slightly. "So let me get this straight," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "You want me to keep paying the bills, keep the house running, and you'll take your retirement money and do your own thing? Is that the plan?" Michael shifted in his chair, his confidence cracking under her steady stare. "It's not like that, Rebecca," he said, backpedaling slightly. "I just thought after all these years we could try something new. I'd still help out. I'm not abandoning you." The tension in the kitchen thickened, stretching into silence. Then Rebecca simply nodded. "All right," she said. Michael nearly choked on his next bite. He coughed, setting his fork down with a clatter, his eyes widening. He had expected an argument, resistance, a flurry of emotions. But this quiet acceptance threw him off balance. "Just all right?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion. Rebecca finally looked up, her hazel eyes meeting his with a cool, unreadable gaze. "Haven't you already decided everything?" she asked, tilting her head. Her tone was even, almost conversational, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something he couldn't quite place. Across the table, Emma let out a sudden snort of laughter, quickly masking it with a fake cough. She darted a glance at her mother, then back at her father, clearly enjoying this unexpected twist. Michael shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his decision suddenly feeling heavier than before. He had thought this plan was simple, logical, fair. But as he looked across the table at his wife and daughter, a quiet unease settled in his chest. Something told him that Rebecca's agreement wasn't a surrender. It was the opening move of a game he didn't realize he had started. The next morning, Michael shuffled into the kitchen, his eyes still heavy with sleep. The house was quiet except for the familiar ticking of the old wall clock. He yawned and stretched, making his way to the cupboard above the sink, reaching instinctively for his morning ritual, a cup of his favorite imported Italian coffee. His fingers brushed past an old box of tea bags and a half-empty jar of instant decaf, Rebecca's, not his. He frowned, moving things around, searching the shelf again. But his coffee was gone. "Rebecca," he called, still groggy. "Where's my coffee?" From down the hall her voice came back, light and unconcerned. "Oh, I didn't buy it." Michael blinked in confusion. "What?" He stepped further into the kitchen, watching as Rebecca tied her hair into a ponytail, already dressed in her workout leggings and a loose tank top. She slipped on her sneakers, barely looking up at him. It's too expensive for my budget now, she said casually, adjusting the strap of her gym bag. If you want it, you'll have to pick it up yourself. Michael stood still for a moment, letting her words sink in. Her budget. Right. This was part of the new system, separate finances. He had suggested it himself. This was just an adjustment, a small inconvenience. Fine, he muttered, shutting the cupboard a little harder than necessary. He'd pick up the coffee later. But as the days passed, those small inconveniences began piling up. On Tuesday morning, he stepped into the shower, lathering shampoo into his hair, until the bottle let out a pathetic sputter. Empty. He tilted it upside down, squeezing desperately, but nothing came out. He turned to check the shower caddy, expecting a backup bottle, but all he found was Rebecca's floral-scented conditioner. Later that evening, as he reached for his razor, he discovered that his shaving gel was nearly finished. He shook the can, tapping the bottom, hoping for just a little more. A thin, uneven streak sputtered out, barely enough to cover his jawline. He made a mental note to buy more. By Thursday, he noticed his gas tank hovering just above empty. He had always taken for granted that there was enough fuel to get him through the week, never questioning how or when it was filled. But now, as he sat in his car at a red light, the warning light blinking on his dashboard, it hit him Rebecca had been the one keeping track of it all. Then came the internet bill. A white envelope arrived in the mail, addressed solely to him. Michael tore it open, expecting the usual household bill, but instead, his name was printed alone at the top. His brows furrowed as he scanned the details. The total balance, the due date, all of it now solely his responsibility. Frowning, he walked into the living room where Rebecca sat curled up on the couch, flipping through a book. Rebecca, why is the internet bill in my name? She didn't look up. Because the account is under your name, she said simply. I only pay for my mobile now. Michael stared at her, trying to process. So, I have to pay for the whole thing. Rebecca finally glanced up, her face neutral. That's what separate finances mean, right? His mouth opened then closed. He had no immediate response because technically she was right. He set the bill down on the coffee table with a little more force than necessary. Rebecca simply returned to her book, unbothered. Michael exhaled sharply and stalked toward the kitchen. He yanked open the fridge, half expecting something, anything, to make this day feel normal again. But what he saw stopped him cold. The fridge was neatly divided. On the left side, everything looked as it always had. Fresh produce, a carton of eggs, neatly stacked containers of leftovers, even a few of Emma's favorite yogurts, each labeled with her name in black marker. Everything was in order, just as it had been for years. On the right side, his side, there was almost nothing. A half-eaten sandwich from 2 days ago, a lonely ketchup bottle, and a single can of soda. Michael stood there for a long moment, staring at the divide. Rebecca wasn't arguing. She wasn't even trying to make a point. She was simply following the plan. And for the first time, Michael wondered if he had miscalculated.
Understand
Friday evening arrived, but the house felt different. It lacked the usual warmth, the comforting rhythm of routine that had been there for years. Michael pushed open the front door, exhausted from a long, frustrating day. He loosened his tie, inhaling deeply, and then, he smelled it. The rich, buttery scent of freshly baked pies filled the air. His stomach growled in response. His mouth watered. It had been a long week, and the thought of sinking his teeth into one of Rebecca's homemade cabbage pies, his absolute favorite, was enough to momentarily lift his spirits. A rare smile crept onto his face as he stepped into the kitchen, ready to grab a plate. Then he saw it. A neat stack of golden brown pies sat on the table, steam still curling from their crisp edges. But just above them, taped to the cabinet, was a note in Rebecca's precise handwriting. "These are for Emma and me. Your half of the fridge is on the right." Michael stared at the note, his eyes scanning the words over and over again. His stomach rumbled again, but the hunger was quickly overtaken by something else. Disbelief, then irritation. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. Before he could react, footsteps approached. Emma strolled in, cradling a mug of tea in one hand. She barely glanced at him before her eyes locked onto the pies. With practiced ease, she grabbed one, biting into it with an exaggerated hum of satisfaction. "Man, these are amazing," she said, chewing happily. "Oh, sorry, Dad." She gestured vaguely toward the note. "Mom and I already ate." Michael turned to face her fully. "Emma," he started, but she was already heading for the hallway. "Good luck with dinner," she called over her shoulder, a smirk tugging at her lips. Michael stood frozen for a moment, staring at the pies that sat just inches away, yet entirely out of reach. He turned to the fridge and yanked it open. His side remained as pitiful as before. A ketchup bottle, a can of soda, and an untouched pack of rice he had no intention of cooking. The weight of it all pressed down on him. The empty cupboards. The forgotten bills. The gas tank he had nearly run dry. He had thought this was just a rough patch, a small adjustment. But now, standing alone in the quiet kitchen, it dawned on him. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was a message. And for the first time, Michael wasn't sure he liked what it meant. Saturday morning arrived with an unusual stillness in the Lawson household. Normally, Michael would wake up to the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee, or the soft sounds of Rebecca moving around the kitchen. But today the house felt eerily quiet. He sat up in bed, rubbing the sleep from his eyes before heading toward the kitchen, half hoping that things would return to normal. But nothing had changed. He reached for the cupboard out of habit, only to remember that his favorite coffee was still missing. With a frustrated sigh, he shut the door a little harder than necessary before turning to the fridge. His side remained just as empty as before. Michael stood there for a long moment, staring at the meager selection. A block of cheese, a bottle of ketchup, and a single can of soda mocked him from the otherwise barren shelf. He had meant to go grocery shopping, but the week had slipped away from him. His eyes drifted to the left side, their side, where neatly packed containers sat in perfect order. A fresh carton of orange juice, a pack of yogurt labeled with Emma's name, and a tray of leftovers from last night's dinner. The contrast was jarring, a visible reminder of the invisible wall that had been built between them. His stomach grumbled, but his pride kept him from reaching for anything that wasn't on his side. Just then, soft footsteps approached behind him. Rebecca entered the kitchen, already dressed in a sleek deep plum loungewear set that accentuated her features. She moved with quiet confidence, her posture relaxed as she made her way to the counter. A faint scent of perfume trailed behind her, not the inexpensive kind she used to wear, but something richer, more refined. Michael narrowed his eyes slightly. When had she bought that? She poured hot water into a mug, the aroma of herbal tea filling the air. If she noticed Michael standing by the fridge, she didn't acknowledge him. Instead, she stirred her tea gently, blowing on it before taking a slow sip. "You're up early," she said lightly, setting her mug down. Michael closed the fridge and leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Did you go shopping?" Rebecca met his gaze briefly before nodding. "Emma and I picked up a few things yesterday." Michael exhaled, shaking his head. "Right. For your side." Rebecca didn't react. She simply picked up her tea again and took another slow sip. Michael studied her for a long moment, irritation bubbling under the surface. "You know, this is getting ridiculous," he muttered. She raised an eyebrow. "What is this?" "The separate finances thing," he said, motioning vaguely around them. "It's just petty. We used to share everything." Now he gestured toward the fridge. Dividing up groceries? Keeping track of who buys what? Rebecca placed her mug down with a quiet clink, folding her arms. That's what you wanted, isn't it? Michael opened his mouth, then faltered. He had no immediate response because technically, yes, it had been his idea. He had framed it as logical, practical, fair. But now, standing in this kitchen that had once felt like the heart of their home, everything felt off-kilter. Rebecca tilted her head slightly, watching him with that same calm, unreadable expression. Michael, she said evenly, you expected me to keep everything running the way it always has while you kept your money separate. That's not how it works. His jaw tightened. That's not what I meant. She exhaled slowly, as if searching for patience. Then what did you mean? Before he could answer, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Emma entered the kitchen, earbuds in, scrolling through her phone. She barely glanced up before heading to the fridge. Unlike Michael, she had no hesitation in reaching for the neatly stacked leftovers, pulling out a container of pasta. Morning, she mumbled, popping the lid off. She grabbed a fork from the drawer and took a bite straight from the container. Michael watched her, something twisting inside him. It was a simple act, his daughter grabbing food from their fridge, but in that moment, it struck him just how much he had cut himself out of their system. He wasn't just separate from their finances, he was separate from them. Emma must have noticed the look on his face because she paused mid-bite, finally making eye contact. What? She asked, mouthful. Michael forced a chuckle, though it lacked humor. Nothing. Just enjoying the view. Emma rolled her eyes, shoving another bite into her mouth before walking toward the living room. Michael turned back to Rebecca. This isn't sustainable, he said, his voice quieter now, tinged with something that almost sounded like uncertainty. Rebecca shrugged. I think it's working just fine. Michael ran a hand down his face, exhaling. You really don't see an issue with this? She gave him a long look before speaking. I see an issue, Michael. But I saw it long before you ever noticed. His stomach twisted again, but he said nothing. Rebecca picked up her mug and walked toward the hallway, pausing at the doorway. If you're struggling, maybe you should rethink your spending. That's what we all have to do now, right? And with that, she was gone, leaving Michael standing alone in the kitchen, his hunger long forgotten. Underscore 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 underscore. The rest of the weekend passed in a haze. Michael found himself in an unfamiliar position, having to think about every small purchase. He stopped himself from ordering takeout when he saw how much he had spent on gas. He hesitated before grabbing an overpriced coffee on his way to work, opting instead for the office brew he usually ignored. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the fact that, for the first time in his adult life, he was aware of it. Sunday evening, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at a notepad where he had scribbled down his expenses for the week. Numbers, calculations, adjustments. It was an exhausting exercise, one Rebecca had done quietly for years while he had coasted along without a second thought. He rubbed his temples. The sound of the front door opening pulled him from his thoughts. He turned just as Rebecca and Emma walked in, laughing softly about something. Emma carried a small bag from the local cafe, her fingers wrapped around a plastic cup of iced coffee. Hey, Dad, she greeted, setting the bag on the counter. Michael eyed the cafe logo, something sour creeping into his chest. You two went out? Rebecca nodded, setting down her purse. Just for a bit. Thought we'd treat ourselves. Treat themselves. The distinction was there. The separation. Michael leaned back in his chair, watching as Rebecca moved with quiet ease, unpacking her things, completely unaffected. Emma had already disappeared into her room, music playing softly behind her closed door. He felt out of place, like a guest in his own home. Rebecca glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. Something wrong? He hesitated. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to tell her that everything felt wrong, that this division wasn't what he had imagined, that he hadn't realized how much she did until now, that he felt left out in a way that made his chest ache. But he didn't. Instead, he exhaled, shaking his head. No, nothing's wrong. Rebecca held his gaze for a second longer before nodding. Good. And just like that, the moment passed. But Michael knew deep down that things weren't going back to the way they were. He just wasn't sure if that was his choice anymore. By Monday morning, Michael's frustration had settled into something heavier, an uncomfortable awareness that things had shifted beyond his control. He had assumed that Rebecca would eventually tire of this, separate finances arrangement, and things would naturally return to the way they had always been. But as the days passed, he realized she wasn't backing down. She wasn't even protesting. She was simply letting him experience the reality of what he had demanded. The morning routine felt unfamiliar. He had always taken for granted that there would be fresh coffee waiting for him, that his clothes would be clean and neatly folded, that the fridge would have exactly what he needed. Now the absence of those small comforts gnawed at him in ways he hadn't anticipated. As he shuffled into the kitchen, Rebecca was already dressed in her workout gear, tying her sneakers at the front door. She looked refreshed, energized, completely unaffected by the strain he was feeling. Michael leaned against the counter, watching her. Listen, he began, trying to keep his tone neutral. Is this some kind of demonstration? Rebecca raised an eyebrow, pausing mid-knot. What are you talking about? He gestured vaguely around the kitchen. This. The separate finances thing. Are you proving a point? Rebecca's expression didn't change. She finished tying her sneakers, straightened up, and picked up her gym bag. I'm just following the plan, Michael, she said smoothly. Everyone spends only what they earn, remember? Michael clenched his jaw. Yeah, but She held up a hand, cutting him off. If this is hard for you, maybe you should rethink how you're managing your money. That's what we all have to do now, right? And with that, she slung her bag over her shoulder and walked out the door, leaving him standing in the middle of the kitchen, feeling oddly dismissed. Underscore 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 underscore. Later that evening, as Michael was sorting through the mail, he noticed a thick envelope sitting on the counter. It had Rebecca's name on it, but she had left it open. He hesitated before picking it up, curiosity getting the better of him. Inside, he found neatly stacked bank statements, transaction records, and financial summaries, all in Rebecca's name. His brows furrowed as he flipped through the pages. The numbers didn't make sense. She had savings, investments, a steady stream of income. Michael's stomach tightened as realization dawned on him. He had always assumed Rebecca depended entirely on the household money he provided. But here it was in black and white. She had been quietly building her own financial security for years. Just then, Rebecca walked in, carrying a grocery bag. She set it down on the counter and glanced at the papers in his hands. I see you found my records. Michael lifted the stack slightly. You've been saving? His voice was quieter now, uncertain. She nodded, calmly unpacking the groceries. Yes. For how long? Rebecca gave a small shrug. 10 years, give or take. Michael's mouth went dry. Why didn't you tell me? She met his gaze, her expression steady. You never asked. Silence stretched between them. Michael looked back down at the numbers, flipping through the pages again. He had assumed he was the one in control, the one making all the financial decisions. But the truth was, Rebecca had been preparing for this moment long before he ever suggested separate finances. She hadn't been caught off guard. She had been waiting. A slow, sinking feeling settled in Michael's chest. He wasn't sure what was more unsettling, the fact that she had been quietly saving behind his back, or the realization that he had never once considered she might need to. Rebecca picked up a head of lettuce from the bag and placed it in the fridge, as if this conversation wasn't unraveling everything he thought he knew. I started small, she continued. A little bit from the grocery budget, then side jobs, selling handmade embroidery, doing manicures for neighbors. 3 years ago, I launched an online store. It's doing well. Michael swallowed hard. You have a business? She nodded, closing the fridge door. Yes. Michael let out a short breath, running a hand over his face. And Emma? Does she know? Of course. His head snapped up. What? Rebecca leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. I've been teaching her. She already has her own savings. She even invests. Michael felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. His daughter, his 17-year-old daughter, was more financially aware than he was. Rebecca tilted her head slightly, watching his expression change. You always thought I just handled the house, made sure everything ran smoothly. And I did. But I also made sure I was never left without options. Michael stared at her, his grip tightening around the papers. He had spent years believing he was the one steering the ship, the one taking care of their family's future. But now he realized he had only been looking at half the picture. Rebecca had been the quiet force holding everything together. And he had never noticed. For the first time since this whole thing started, Michael wasn't just annoyed. He was afraid. Not because Rebecca had been saving. Not because Emma had her own financial plans. But because for the first time he wasn't sure if they still needed him. 3 weeks had passed since Michael first declared that their finances should be separate. At the time he had envisioned a system that gave him more control, more freedom. He had assumed that Rebecca would struggle without his financial support and that, eventually, she would concede, admitting that his way made more sense. That hadn't happened. Instead, the house had shifted around him, adapting to this new reality as if he had never been the center of it. The fridge remained neatly divided. The bills arriving in his name were his to manage. The small comforts he had once taken for granted, coffee magically replenishing itself, gas always in the car, his clothes washed and folded, had all vanished. But the most unsettling part wasn't the change in household logistics. It was the quiet confidence in Rebecca's demeanor, the unshaken steadiness with which she carried herself. She hadn't argued. She hadn't resisted. She had simply adapted. And now Michael was the one struggling. On a crisp Sunday morning he sat at the kitchen table, staring down at a notebook filled with scribbled numbers. He had been tracking his expenses for the first time in years, forced to calculate every grocery trip, every bill, every unnecessary indulgence. His finances weren't in crisis, yet, but they were tighter than he had anticipated. He had been spending carelessly for years without ever truly feeling the weight of it. Now every purchase felt like a conscious decision. The sound of soft footsteps pulled his attention from the numbers. Rebecca walked into the kitchen, her hair in a loose braid, carrying a fresh bag of groceries. She placed the bag on the counter, then turned to him, noticing the notebook. "How's it looking?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of tea. Michael sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's balanced. I had to cut back on a few things. No more fancy coffee runs. Canceled the car wash membership." He let out a small, humorless chuckle. "Turns out, I was spending a ridiculous amount on things I never even thought about." Rebecca took a slow sip of tea. "Different, isn't it?" Michael leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "Yeah, not bad. Just new." He glanced down at the notebook again, running a finger over the last calculation he had made. "I never realized how much you were managing." Rebecca didn't say anything, but the knowing look in her eyes told him she had been waiting for this realization. Just then Emma walked in, her laptop tucked under one arm. She set it down on the counter, grinning. "Dad, you should check out my investments. I'm up 12% this month." Michael blinked, caught off guard. "Wait, what?" Emma pulled up a few charts on her screen, scrolling through them with ease. "Mom's been helping me. I've been putting my babysitting money and Etsy profits into a few stocks. Just started small, but it's adding up." Michael stared at the screen, then at his daughter. "You invest?" Emma laughed. Yeah, Dad. You know, making your money work for you and all that. Michael opened his mouth, then closed it. A few months ago, he might have chuckled and patted her on the head, dismissing it as a cute hobby. Now, seeing the numbers, seeing her confidence, it hit him differently. His daughter was smarter with money than he had been for most of his life. Rebecca stepped past him, pulling a small item from the grocery bag and setting it in front of him. A jar of his favorite Italian coffee. Michael looked up at her, surprised. What's this? Rebecca shrugged, a small smile playing at her lips. Thought you might need it. He picked up the jar, running his fingers over the label. A simple gesture, but one that carried more weight than he could explain. He set it down carefully. Thanks. Rebecca leaned against the counter, studying him. I've been thinking, she said, her tone casual but measured. Maybe you'd like to help with my online store. Michael's head snapped up. You want me to work with you? She nodded. Why not? You've got good business sense. Just used it in the wrong places before. Michael hesitated, searching her face. There was no condescension in her tone. No lingering resentment. Just an offer. An invitation. On one condition, she added, tilting her head slightly. Equal partners. Michael let out a breath, nodding slowly. Equal partners. The words felt unfamiliar on his tongue, but not unwelcome. Rebecca smiled, picking up her tea again. Michael sat there for a long moment, absorbing the shift in their dynamic. He had spent years thinking his role was to lead the family, to be the provider. But now he saw things differently. Rebecca had never needed him in the way he assumed. She had always been capable. She had always been strong. The only difference now was that he finally saw it. And maybe for the first time in a long time, he was ready to stand beside her instead of ahead of her. Michael took a bite of his dinner, trying to shake the uneasy feeling settling in his chest. Rebecca continued slicing her chicken with practiced ease, her expression calm, almost indifferent. Emma, between bites, smirked as she scrolled through her phone, the glow from the screen reflecting in her sharp eyes. Michael had expected some pushback. He had prepared for it. In fact, he had spent the last week mentally rehearsing his reasons: financial independence, fairness, personal responsibility. He had expected arguments, maybe even anger. What he hadn't anticipated was this. The absence of resistance unnerved him. Rebecca wasn't the type to bottle things up. If she was upset, she let him know. But tonight, she simply ate, nodding along as if his announcement had been nothing more than an update on the weather. Michael set his fork down. So you agree? Rebecca looked up, meeting his gaze with quiet ease. Of course, she said. If that's what you want. That was it. No hesitation. No further discussion. Michael nodded slowly, picking his fork back up. Good, he said, though it didn't sound as confident as he had intended. For the rest of dinner, Rebecca and Emma talked about Emma's upcoming school project. Their conversation easy and unbothered. Michael chewed his food mechanically, barely tasting it. He told himself this was a win. After all, wasn't this what he wanted? But as he watched his wife and daughter interact as if nothing had changed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had. The next morning, Michael awoke to silence. The house was quiet, except for the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. Normally, Rebecca would be making coffee, the rich scent filling the air as she moved about the kitchen, humming softly to herself. Today there was nothing. Frowning, he dragged himself out of bed and into the kitchen. The coffee pot was empty. The usual bag of his favorite imported Italian roast was missing from its usual spot in the cupboard. He checked the pantry, rummaging through the shelves, but there was no sign of it. Rebecca, he called out. Her voice drifted in from the living room. Yes. Michael stepped into the room to find her sitting on the couch sipping tea. She looked up from her book, eyebrows raised expectantly. "Where's the coffee?" he asked. "Oh, I didn't buy it," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Michael blinked. "Why not?" Rebecca shrugged. "It's too expensive for my budget now. If you want it, you'll have to pick it up yourself." Michael stood there for a moment processing. Right. Her budget. He had spent years assuming the coffee just appeared like magic. Rebecca always stocked the house, managed the groceries, kept everything running. He had never had to think about it. Fine, he told himself. It was a minor inconvenience. Nothing more. "I'll grab some later," he muttered, retreating back to the kitchen. He poured himself a cup of Rebecca's tea, grimacing at the weak taste. It was a small thing, but for some reason it unsettled him. By the end of the week, small inconveniences had turned into something more. Tuesday morning, he stepped into the shower, lathering shampoo into his hair, until the bottle let out a pathetic sputter. Empty. He glanced around, expecting to find a new one, but all that remained was Rebecca's floral-scented conditioner. Later that night, he reached for his razor, only to realize he was nearly out of shaving gel. He shook the can, trying to squeeze out one last bit. Nothing. He groaned, making another mental note to stop by the store. Thursday, he slid into his car, only to find the gas tank hovering just above empty. He cursed under his breath. When had that happened? Normally it was filled up just before it reached this point. But of course that was when Rebecca was in charge of handling these things. Then came the internet bill. A white envelope arrived in the mail, addressed solely to him. Michael tore it open, expecting the usual household bill. But instead, his name was printed alone at the top. His brows furrowed as he scanned the details. The total balance, the due date, all of it now solely his responsibility. Frowning, he walked into the living room where Rebecca sat curled up on the couch, flipping through a book. "Rebecca, why is the internet bill in my name?" She didn't look up. "Because the account is under your name," she said simply. "I only pay for my mobile now." Michael stared at her, trying to process. "So, I have to pay for the whole thing." Rebecca finally glanced up, her face neutral. "That's what separate finances mean, right?" His mouth opened then closed. He had no immediate response because technically she was right. He set the bill down on the coffee table with a little more force than necessary. Rebecca simply returned to her book, unbothered. Michael exhaled sharply and stalked toward the kitchen. He yanked open the fridge, half expecting something, anything, to make this day feel normal again. But what he saw stopped him cold. The fridge was neatly divided. On the left side, everything looked as it always had. Fresh produce, a carton of eggs, neatly stacked containers of leftovers, even a few of Emma's favorite yogurts, each labeled with her name in black marker. Everything was in order, just as it had been for years. On the right side, his side, there was almost nothing. A half-eaten sandwich from 2 days ago, a lonely ketchup bottle, and a single can of soda. Michael stood there for a long moment, staring at the divide. Rebecca wasn't arguing. She wasn't even trying to make a point. She was simply following the plan. And for the first time, Michael wondered if he had miscalculated. Friday evening arrived, but the house felt different. It lacked the usual warmth, the comforting rhythm of routine that had been there for years. Michael pushed open the front door, exhausted from a long, frustrating day. He loosened his tie, inhaling deeply, and then, he smelled it. The rich, buttery scent of freshly baked pies filled the air. His stomach growled in response. His mouth watered. It had been a long week, and the thought of sinking his teeth into one of Rebecca's homemade cabbage pies, his absolute favorite, was enough to momentarily lift his spirits. A rare smile crept onto his face as he stepped into the kitchen, ready to grab a plate. Then he saw it. A neat stack of golden brown pies sat on the table, steam still curling from their crisp edges. But just above them, taped to the cabinet, was a note in Rebecca's precise handwriting. "These are for Emma and me. Your half of the fridge is on the right." Michael stared at the note, his eyes scanning the words over and over again. His stomach rumbled again, but the hunger was quickly overtaken by something else. Disbelief, then irritation. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. Before he could react, footsteps approached. Emma strolled in, cradling a mug of tea in one hand. She barely glanced at him before her eyes locked onto the pies. With practiced ease, she grabbed one, biting into it with an exaggerated hum of satisfaction. "Man, these are amazing," she said, chewing happily. "Oh, sorry, Dad." She gestured vaguely toward the note. "Mom and I already ate." Michael turned to face her fully. "Emma," he started, but she was already heading for the hallway. "Good luck with dinner," she called over her shoulder, a smirk tugging at her lips. Michael stood frozen for a moment, staring at the pies that sat just inches away, yet entirely out of reach. He had thought this was just a small adjustment. But now, standing alone in the quiet kitchen, it dawned on him. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was a message. And for the first time, Michael wasn't sure he liked what it meant. The story of Michael and Rebecca serves as a powerful lesson in financial independence, personal responsibility, and shifting gender roles. As we enter 2025, financial transparency and shared responsibilities in relationships are more important than ever. Michael's belief that separating finances would give him control ultimately backfired, exposing how little he understood about household economics. His experience highlights the risks of financial ignorance and the necessity of recognizing all forms of contribution in a partnership. One of Michael's biggest mistakes was assuming that money alone kept the household running. He failed to see the invisible labor Rebecca contributed, managing expenses, grocery shopping, paying bills, and keeping everything organized. When she quietly withdrew from these responsibilities, he was left struggling. This highlights the importance of financial literacy. In 2025, financial awareness is essential. With inflation, rising living costs, and an increasingly digital economy, individuals must actively manage their finances. Michael's struggle to track expenses and pay bills reflects the common issue of financial dependence. More couples are now using budgeting apps, setting financial goals together, and ensuring that both partners understand household finances to avoid such blind spots. Traditionally, men like Michael believed that earning money was their primary contribution, while women handled household responsibilities. However, Rebecca's response reveals how modern partnerships require balance. Her quiet decision to follow his rules exposed how much he had taken her efforts for granted. In 2025, relationships require equal participation in both financial and domestic responsibilities. Couples must communicate about budgeting, savings, and workload distribution. Financial independence is valuable, but it should not be used as a tool for control. A household thrives when both partners contribute fairly, whether through income, household management, or emotional support. Rebecca's actions emphasize the power of financial independence. Unlike Michael, she had been preparing for years, saving, investing, and even running a small business. This foresight ensured she was never completely dependent. She also passed this mindset to Emma, who had already started investing as a teenager. This highlights the need for financial preparedness in 2025. Everyone, regardless of gender, should maintain an emergency fund and have control over their own finances. Teaching financial literacy from a young age, as Rebecca did with Emma, ensures future generations do not repeat the mistakes of financial dependence. Michael's experience is a cautionary tale. He assumed control but was left struggling. Rebecca, on the other hand, was financially secure and emotionally prepared. Their story teaches us that financial independence should be a shared goal, not a power play. In 2025, the key lessons are clear. Financial literacy is essential, relationships must be built on mutual contributions, and financial decisions should be made collaboratively, not as a means of control. Those who fail to understand this may, like Michael, find themselves learning the hard way. We've all made decisions that at the time seemed reasonable, only to later realize we didn't fully understand the consequences. That's exactly where Michael is now. He thought separating finances would give him control, would make things fair. Instead, he finds himself struggling while Rebecca and Emma continue on, unfazed by his so-called independence. Michael isn't a bad person. He's not malicious or cruel. He simply made a mistake, one that many of us have made in different ways. He assumed things would remain the same, that the household would function as it always had, even after he changed the rules. But reality has hit him hard. The bills are his responsibility now. The fridge isn't magically stocked. Even the small comforts like his favorite coffee are suddenly gone. And worst of all, he's beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as essential to the household as he thought. But does Michael deserve to struggle alone? Is there still a way for him to fix this? That's where you come in. Michael now faces a crossroads. He could continue down this path, stubbornly refusing to admit his mistake, pushing forward despite the loneliness creeping in. Or he could take a step back, acknowledge where he went wrong and try to rebuild. Not just his finances but his relationship with Rebecca and Emma. The question is, how should he do it? If you were in Michael's shoes, what would you do? Should he apologize to Rebecca and ask to work as a team again? Recognizing that household labor is just as valuable as financial contributions? A fully embrace financial independence, proving to himself and his family that he can take care of his own responsibilities without relying on them? Find a compromise where both he and Rebecca contribute equally, not just in money but in effort, time, and household management. Do something completely unexpected that could shift the power dynamic in a way neither of them expected? Michael needs advice and you have the power to give it. What would you tell him? Should he fight to restore what he lost? Or should he learn to live by the rules he created? Drop your thoughts in the comments and help shape what happens next.